G'day, this is Dave Boyle, author of the VisualWRAP software. VisualWRAP is a software package to help you work with cross wraps, decorative wraps that are typically done above the foregrip or in the split grip of a fishing rod and designed to make your rod stand out. It's a form of artwork which appeals to me. I don't know why, but I'm just fascinated by the way you can make patterns out of threads. When I was going through university, I learned how to make a fishing rod. I followed a magazine, and from that point onwards, I was hooked. After making my first couple of rods, I wanted to be able to decorate those rods, and I discovered a book by Dale Clemens called Custom Rod Thread Art. I started looking at that book and trying to work out how these patterns formed, and that got me on my way to a lifetime's passion of understanding how cross-wrap patterns form. So the book Custom Rod Thread Art was by a guy called Dale Clemens, and it goes into some detail about how cross-wrap patterns are formed. He starts off by talking about a common language, and when I read this book, I'm an engineer by background, and I was interested in understanding the technical aspect of cross wraps. And what Dale Clemens talked about was very important to me. A common language. It was a way of describing conventions, naming conventions. For example, what's considered top, bottom, left, and right on your rod. And interestingly, these days people still argue about what the right terms are. Regardless, I was able to follow the conventions that were described by Dale Clemens and put those into a scripting language, which then allowed me to, in software, draw lines on the screen to describe cross-wrap patterns. Now, when I was just getting into cross-wrap patterns, I was just passionate about wanting to make better rods. And after having made a couple of rods, I wanted to learn how to decorate them. And so I used to scroll through this book and look for patterns to follow. And I remember one pattern in particular which stood out to me was this number 16 snowflake pattern. And in Clemens' book, he shows you the layout threads to use, and he talks about what sequence to follow. And by following that sequence and those layout threads, you'll end up with a particular pattern. And I thought that was fascinating. So I did my best and I followed the pattern, and I ended up coming up with a pattern which at the time I was pretty proud of. I thought it was great. And now when I look at it, 20 something years later, I can see that I did not actually do a snowflake pattern at all, but it's just a series of boxes. And according to today's standards, this is a terrible cross wrap, and if I was a true blue nerd, I would be cutting it off. But I've kept it, and I'm quite proud of this rod. I think this was one of the first cross wraps that I'd done, and to me it was fantastic. It was on a bait casting rod, which I used to use fishing for trout, and to me I was so proud of this rod. And until the day that I snapped the tip, putting the rod back into the trunk of the car one day, I used this rod quite a lot. So the thing that made me want to write some software was the fact that this pattern took me a long time to do. And in the end, it didn't even turn out like the picture in the book. So I thought there had to be a better way. Now, Clemens talked about a common language in his book, and having a technical background and being interested in computer programming, I thought, well, surely there's a computer program. If I can draw lines on the screen to represent threads, if I follow a certain sequence, and if I use threads of a certain color in a certain starting position, then I can predict how a pattern's going to look. So I put my mind to it, and in the early 90s started playing around with ideas. Now, in 2002, I actually launched the VisualWRAP software, and if I'd had this software back in the day, I would have been able to simply open up the pattern that I was interested in. In this case, the snowflake is custom rod thread art number 17. And once it was loaded, I could have wrapped the pattern, seen what it looked like, and very quickly seen how it looked in 3 dimensions. Just taking a little moment to load. In reality, back when I was making rods, a pattern like this would take me 5 or 6 hours to wrap, and after having spent that much time on the rod, regardless of how good or bad I thought the pattern looked, it was staying on there no matter what. So I understood it would be important going forward for me to understand how a pattern is going to look, be able to size it correctly for the size of my blank, and be happy with the color patterns that, or the color combinations that were going to be used. Because no one wants to spend 6 hours wrapping something only to discover it's too large, or the colors don't pop, or you're not happy with it for whatever reason. So I put my mind to how I might do this in software, and it took me about 5 years of part-time effort to come up with the pattern, or the software, which is called VisualWRAP. It's driven by scripts, and scripts are basically a programming language which captures the common language that Clemens described in his custom rod thread art. So my one hope was that one day I would meet Mr. Clemens and shake his hand and thank him for publishing his book, because it inspired me to think outside the square and push the limits of my creativity to come up with something special. Unfortunately, I never got to meet Dale, and he passed away before I had been able to spend any significant amount of time in the States. Regardless, I think his legend lives on, as do the legends of those who assisted Clemens in putting together his book. B.D. Ehler, I know, has been instrumental in a lot of the patterns that appear in the book and the tape replicas that are shown there. So, to me, the most important things about VisualWRAP are you can very quickly see what a pattern is going to look like. You can slow down the action, which allows you to see how the threads are going to be laid down one after the other, and that allows you to see how the sequence progresses. That's important so that you can get a feel for what are the threads to wrap next on your rod. Without being able to see this step by step, it can be quite confusing and sometimes quite difficult to understand. But by seeing threads being laid one after the other in a particular sequence, that really helps, in my opinion, to let you see how a pattern is going to develop. Another thing which I think is very important is changing colors quickly. So you can see in this pattern we have purple threads, yellow threads, and a black background. Now I might decide that my yellow would be better off in a terracotta color, and my purple may be better off in a green color. And if I quickly wrap that, I can instantly see that that's a disastrous color combination to be using. So I will definitely not use that color combo on my rod. I might change the green to something that's more subdued, shall we say, a turquoise, wrap that. That's somewhat better. And then my background, instead of a black, now I might use something like a brown, a darker brown, wrap that. Now, that doesn't look very good. However, I've decided that very quickly. So after spending 1 minute of clicking and wrapping on my screen, I can quickly decide what color combination is going to work best on my rod. I can see that in 3D and I can decide, yep, that looks okay. There are 3 pattern repeats shown there. What would it look like with, say, 5? Let's have a look at that. Yep, not bad. If I was then ready to wrap this onto my rod, I would need to be able to size it correctly. So the software has got a feature called the taper view, which allows you to take a measurement at the butt end or the fat end of the rod and take a measurement of the diameter at the tip end of the rod where the pattern is going to end. And if I make this a little bit more dramatic just for a demonstration, that graphically resizes the pattern so that the pattern will close nicely. On closed wraps, it's important to taper your spacing to enable the threads to close nicely at the tip end. You have more surface area in a shorter length at the butt end, and for the same length at the tip end you have a smaller surface area. That surface area can only be taken up by threads, therefore mathematically it's vital for you to change your spacing as you go along a tapered rod, and the more tapered the rod is, the more important it is to taper that spacing. This software allows you to do that graphically. I can print that out true to size. I can take measurements from that printout. I can also create a spacing table which gives you the numbers or the measurements. I can draw those measurements onto the actual pattern to tell me what distance I need to measure each of these centers when I lay out my initial spacings for the rod. And that means if I keep those centers correctly spaced when I try to close my pattern, the last several threads should fit in nicely. So in a nutshell, that's a brief history of VisualWRAP, how it came into being, why it's here today, and some of its features. I note quite proudly that as the years have gone on, VisualWRAP has simply become more popular. In the early days, not a lot of people who were building rods were particularly into using computer software. I mean, there was not other computer software available commercially to be used for this sort of hobby or this sort of job for some people. And as we've gone on, the prevalence of computers in modern day society and internet with the ease of social media, sharing of images and ideas and thoughts has meant that the software has gone from strength to strength. It's through the software that I met one of my best mates, Billy Vivona, and he's created the NURBS, and those guys do amazing things with threads. It's mind-blowing to see the quality of the work that a lot of those guys come up with, and their motto is, it's not a club, it's a state of mind, a way of thinking about what you do and always raising the bar. And it's a case of never settling, never taking the easy option. A lot of the guys pride themselves on the fact that they'll cut off a a wrap that they've spent 12 hours putting onto a rod simply because they're not happy with the color combinations, or the fact that the spacing is not 100% correct. It's because of this that we see an amazing array of new patterns being created, and a level of technical difficulty being achieved by some guys today. I'm very proud to have some small part in fostering that, and I'm proud to call the NURBs my friends. Now that I live in the States, I'm attending more NURBs functions when I can, and hope in the future to be an integral part of the organisation going forward. So thank you for listening to the brief history of VisualWRAP. I hope that it answers some of your questions and maybe piques your curiosity to find out more. I'm available on email, davidboyle@visualwrap.com. You can go to threadcentral.net to find out more about the software, and I hope that you enjoy cross-wrapping as much as I do.